Hello. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm really delighted to see so many people in the room, and I know we have quite a few people participating online as well. So it's a beautiful sunny day here in Exeter, so I'm delighted that you guys have stepped away from the sunshine and come to hear about shame, poverty and health, which aren't particularly sunny topics mixed together. I'm really delighted to have Professor Robert Walker coming today all the way from China, from Beijing. He's come to share some of his research with us, and Felicity Thomas and Lucy Hodges from our very own Wellcome Centre also will present today. So this is a topic that's particularly close to my heart and to my research interests. I'm really interested in the intersections between shame and health, and of course shame, health and poverty are also inextricably intertwined questions around physical and mental health in terms of how shame affects those living in poverty. So recent research has confirmed what people who live in poverty have known all along, that being poor is inherently shameful, and this has profound consequences for one's personal experience, one's social relations, and how one is situated within social structures and in relation to institutions, and of course how that impacts on one's health. Stigmatizing societal attitudes about poverty add to the negative experience of lacking material resources and undermine individuals' well-being, their confidence and their dignity. And living with chronic shame, stigma or status anxiety associated with poverty can have really strong implications for health, whether it's depression, mental ill health, physical ill health, or perhaps even suicide. So this seminar, the aim of it is to bring three diverse perspectives together to reflect on this intersection of shame, poverty and health, both in the UK and internationally. So the way we'll run the seminar is I'll introduce our first speaker, and then we'll have the three talks running consecutively, and then at the end, I think there'll be 20 minutes each more or less, and then at the end we'll open up for general discussion, so there can be questions from within the room and from online if there are any questions online as well. So we'll hear the talks first and then we'll open up for discussion. So our first speaker is Professor Robert Walker, so many of you might know his work. He's a professor in the School of Social Development and Public Policy in Beijing Normal University and Professor Emeritus at the University of Oxford. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and was awarded an MBE by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 2012 for his services to social policy research. He has served in an advisory capacity to the World Bank, the European Commission, the OECD and the International Labour Office, and to 12 governments including China, as one of 11 foreign experts consulted on the State Council's 2019-2020 work plan. He has published extensively, 22 books, more than 60 research reports, and 150 academic articles and chapters on poverty, social security, and research methodology. So Professor Walker will discuss poverty and shame in an international context, citing the world's largest social assistance system, the rural Dibao in China, and how this avoids stigmatization in a country where the broader public still believe that laziness is the main cause of poverty. So I'll pass it over to Professor Walker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the warm welcome and for telling you all the things that I've done, which just basically says I'm old. And there is shame attached in our society to being old, but I won't focus on that. So thank you for being here. To reiterate, what a wonderful afternoon, and why on earth are you mad enough to be sitting here listening to this? But thank you for being here and doing that. I'm going to talk about poverty, shame, the world and China. I apologise first of all for such a gigantic topic. When you first asked, you try and think, what on earth can I say then? And I'm afraid threw the whole world in. But I am going to focus on the poverty and shame parts, and they do connect with health, although I'm not a health expert and you're going to need to read the health dimension into much of what I'm going to say. But I'm going to talk about, or make 3 points really. And when I get to the end of this slide, those of you who want to go to sleep after a really good lunch can do so, because I'm not going to say any more, just I'm going to say it longer. So I'm arguing that poverty and shame go together, that they're ubiquitous, and what's more, shame isn't something which encourages people's behaviour to change and to cease to be poor, it simply hurts. I'm going to say that poverty and shame certainly go together, but they also pervade the experience of what it's like to be poor. So it's not just a dimension, it's possibly a primary dimension in the experience of poverty. And finally, I'm going to say that poverty-related shame is mediated. It's mediated by a number of things. And I'm going to focus on culture to pick up on the notion that I'm going to look at Dibao in China. I forgot to say I was going to look at Dibao in China, so I didn't realise it was central to my talk. It no longer is, but I get there eventually. I'm also conscious that we've got to go at a reasonable speed to get there, and I'm trying to put on my alarm to make sure that we do. Now I'm going to look at these 3 points with reference to different studies. So I'm going to essentially talk to you, share with you the results of 3 separate studies to provide some sort of an empirical base. And the first study is now quite old, and those of you who haven't read any of my stuff are more likely to have read this than the bits which follow subsequently. But this is in a sense the foundation, the starting point of the journey that researchers have gone on together. And it was really stemmed by a master student who actually read Amartya Sen and came back to my class and said, Amartya Sen argues that whenever you find poverty, you find shame. It's somewhat debatable whether Amartya Sen said that, but what Amartya Sen says really depends on who reads it. So it was a good starting point. But then I wanted to see if you could test that. How it's a universal statement. You can't really test a universal statement. But we went for a maximum difference sort of design. If you find poverty and shame linked together in very disparate environments, that at least adds support to the notion that it's everywhere and always together. And so we worked in a set of disparate countries, 7 initially, covering the global north and global south. And we began by asking the question, can you meaningfully talk about shame and poverty across those cultures at the same time? And the way we sought to answer that question was to look at literature, was to look at oral history, to look at narratives across time, and to look at film. So we looked at a range of cultural experiences and used those, and we concluded, maybe biased, we concluded that it was meaningful to talk about poverty and shame. We then spoke to people who were poor about what life was like. We spoke to people who weren't poor about what they thought about poverty and what they thought about people who were. And finally, we engaged in a process of policy analysis to look at the extent to which shame is permeates the assumptions that we make when we shape policy, the assumptions that we make even implicit in the objectives, and certainly in the way that we deliver policy. And we threw in the United States for fun because I was there and wanted to test American exceptionalism. Okay, so we are talking in those different societies about very different material experiences. Uganda contrasted with Strathclyde. But we found that people in poverty had very similar concerns and very similar aspirations. People talked about food in Uganda, in Pakistan it was very much about enough food. In Norway it was about whether it was the right food, whether it was the right quality, and similarly to a certain extent in the UK. But food was really important in terms of life. It was about survival. Housing, classic requirement. Again, it was slightly different. It was a question of quality in Uganda. Whether you had corrugated iron anywhere in the property, really crucial for children, about children bringing their peers home to something that was in some sense respectful. And in the part of Uganda we were working with, corrugated iron was a significant status symbol. In the UK it was much more about cost. Well, it was about quality, you know, dampness was critical, but it was really about cost. Debt is about control. Across all our societies, people were worried about indebtedness, and as soon as you slip into a debt, your control of your life passes to somebody else. You often feel helpless. You are at the beck and call of others. Social expectations. We want a good family life. We want to be part of the family. We want to be treated equally within the family. Aspirations for education. Nobody, I think, we spoke to across our 6 countries thought that education was a waste of time. They aspired to more education than they'd had, and they invested in their kids, seeing education as the passport to success. Health, again, was central, often issues of access. Also, shame comes into that process, but I'll talk about that a bit later. And fundamentally, as a human being, we're interested in us, how we feel, who we are as a person. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want to note our achievements and hope our achievements outweigh our failures. And people everywhere despise poverty. And the vast majority of themselves, despise themselves because they were poor. And this was, in a sense, an entry into understanding the nature of shame, which was ubiquitous. It wasn't something that you had to pull out, but it wasn't people saying, I feel ashamed. Shame was a word which was seldom used, but there are lots of synonyms for shame, and those were a constant part of the discourse and dialogue. But shame has got at least two components about it. Shame is what we feel, and it's often about our place in relation to the expectations of others, who we are in relation to others, how we are perceived through our perception of others. So that was the first thing. It was this sense of individual failure. The second was that not only that, but other people don't value me. You know, the classic situation of whether you look at the person begging in the street, whether you avoid contact, whether you make the person invisible. And very often the story was, how I feel is that people look over me. They don't see me, they don't recognise me. But shame is an emotion, but it's normally categorised by psychologists as a social emotion. And so it's got two sides. And those of us who aren't poor are part of the environment that creates the experience of shame for those who are. And across those countries we found similar domains in which shame was directly experienced. The family, the nuclear family in the UK, in Norway, and there it was really about this child and my responsibility for this child and my realisation that I can't give this child what I would like to give because I haven't got the resources to do so. Where the word external, of course, should not be external but should be extended. And so in the more collective societies, we were talking about the extended family, whether you got invited to all those big family events and such. School was a cockpit of shame. What the playground and indeed the classroom does is it positions people in society. And those who are poor are at the bottom, and they're told they're poor by teachers, but by kids themselves. We are competing very often on the basis of the possessions that we have. Children hated that experience across countries. The workplace, obviously, the process of rejection on a daily basis where you line up for a job and get it or not. The community, the process of labelling. What's your hypothesis about the main reason for poverty? Is it structural or is it individual? In many societies it's individual. It's the individual's failure. It's one way we justify our high status in society. We did what we should have done, they didn't. Therefore I don't need to care that much because it's their fault. And officialdom, the notion of treating a person not as a person, but as someone to be got through, got over, to treat them as a number, to presume that they shouldn't be here, that they're guilty to be wanting a claim because that's clearly a failure. So these experiences, these scenarios were repeated across countries. How did people respond? They responded in the way that people who argue naming and shaming should work. They tried to do their best. They tried to do their best to maximise the resources and minimise the expenditure. Did they need shame to do that? Of course they didn't. Survival demands that you try and match your budget to your expenditure. Keeping up appearances, a crucial discourse. Not wanting to be seen as different, not wanting my child to stand out, which leads to pretense. Pretense which was sometimes taken on board, that one began to believe the pretense that everything was okay, I didn't need to worry, life was really normal. But there was also withdrawal. There was not wanting to be exposed, not wanting one's poverty to be exposed, not going out to the pub when you can't stand around, not going anywhere. There was also the flip side of that, of not being invited in. Who wants to invite somebody who's not going to stand there around and not going to buy the drinks? This process of quite rapid dissociation from the social networks in which you inhabit once you become poor. Moving on from that, we move on to, well, how do we escape that shame? One is to avoid it by avoiding those scenarios where it arrives. Another is to go into what I think psychologists might call avoidance, to take drink as a way of forgetting what reality is like. Drug alcohol abuse was an aspect, a possibility that stemmed from the shame that people were experiencing. Anger, resistance. The novels we read were full of resistance, of people coming together to fighting the odds, the great stories of how we resisted. Trade union movement, in many ways, is the epitome of that resistance. Remember the trade union movement? It's very difficult to recreate that resistance. Poverty is divisive. People are told that you're lazy. They know they're not. They're working all hours that God sends. But if I'm not lazy, society can't be wrong. They're not all stupid. So it must be other poor people who are lazy. And so that separating out, atomizing people experiencing poverty. And so we came up with this sort of model. That poverty, shame is associated with poverty, leads to a sense of low self-worth and possibly a lack of agency as a consequence. Almost definitely a lack of agency, actually, which could feed through to, if not causing poverty, to perpetuating it, to lengthening spells of poverty. This process of social exclusion, two-way, not wanting to be involved, not being allowed to be involved, which again lowers self-worth, which feeds through to low social capital, not having the people there to support you when things go wrong, which again is cyclical. That's the focus on the individual, but society's doing the shaming because it's bipolar, as I indicated. It's two-way, it's relational, and hopefully we should get policy. And there's no point in that question mark, actually. Policy does it, and I will explain a little bit more about how policy does it later. So that was another thing that I didn't correct in the slides. Okay, so that's the first study. That poverty and shame seem to go together. I'm not saying everywhere. Attest that it's always together, I don't know. But in the 7 countries and then with America thrown in, it was the same. I'm going to take a different tack now, forget shame in a way, and ask what poverty is. What are the dimensions of poverty? You're all aware of Sustainable Development Goals, and Sustainable Development Goal 1.2 asks us to halve poverty in all countries, in all its dimensions, by 2030. But we don't know what those dimensions are. And so we're engaged in a piece of research which sought to find out. And here are 3 research teams in the Global South. You will note they're large research teams. Why are they large? Well, half the people in the research teams are people currently experiencing poverty. So we're talking about people on less than $2 a day in those countries, and somewhat more. A quarter of the research team is made up of practitioners, people who work with people in poverty on a day-to-day basis, and another quarter are made up of academics. And we have research teams in the global north. So we're looking at six countries. The research process, building a research team, persuading people to be, finding people and persuading people to engage, finding people who are able to devote a number of hours a week over a 2.5-year period. Persuading academics that they could contribute to this without consultancy fees, because what's the equity in somebody who's poor being paid differentially less than an academic? And so we've got a selection bias in terms of our academics who were prepared to participate in this research process. Then a process of outreach, to find people who aren't experiencing poverty, often people beyond those who are normally reached by surveys, process of information sharing and engagement and all the other things what one should clearly do in terms of building up research and fulfilling research ethics. Preparatory work with those who are poor, who aren't asked very often about their lives and what it's like. And we spend a lot of time giving people the ability to find and share their voice, to give them the confidence to do so, because ultimately they're going to be talking to and with academics. They work first of all thinking about what their own lives are, then working with other people who are experiencing poverty in their country. We're not just talking about focus groups. The minimum length of time people spent together was around 21 hours. We were typically working on 30 and 35 hours, spread over time sometimes concentrated over a long weekend. And in parallel, we were working similarly with academics and practitioners, asking, what are the dimensions of poverty? And then we brought the groups together, or representatives of the groups together, to see whether their dimensions were similar, whether their dimensions overlapped, whether one dimension described in one way by one group was actually the same as another dimension. And the net result was we did find common dimensions across those groups, across 6 countries, and we ended up this is giving us some of the process. It was pretty systematic. Don't know what we'd have done without post-its, but we were playing with very real experiences and putting them together in various ways. We had 71 dimensions across those 6 countries. The question was, are there 71 dimensions to poverty, or again, are those dimensions using different words for the same thing? So we brought people together from each of those 6 countries, people experiencing poverty, practitioners, academics. There they are in France last year. And again, the answer is yes, we did find common dimensions which were shared in each of those very diverse circumstances. And what were they? Oh, there we are. Process again of putting people together and asking questions. This whole process is one of challenge. We are merging knowledge as the technique, but we're challenging that knowledge as we merge it. So an academic has to defend their position and their understanding, and it's hard. It's hard. I lost on so many occasions in the research team itself about how to do research. I no longer do research in the way that I once did. The process is transformative. And we came up with some answers. We came up with 9 dimensions. The first 3 are dimensions with which people will be very familiar. Lack of decent work, work which is dignified, work which is in some sense consistent, not work that lasts for a few hours or has no contract. Insufficient and insecure income. It doesn't meet needs. You can't predict, you can't plan. You get labelled with this idea of a spendthrift because you don't plan and you don't save. And material and social deprivation are things that we surround ourselves with in our homes, but also the things that society surrounds ourselves with in terms of access to education, access to healthcare. But there were other dimensions. Social maltreatment, the way others treat you. What you have there is a human sculpture. You can see people pushed to the edge of society, turned away by society. That's how it feels. Those were people given the brief of how can you convey what social maltreatment is. Institutional maltreatment. People there are holding numbers. They've been reduced from human beings to numbers being processed by the system. That's how it feels, no longer human. The third of these 3 dimensions, which as you can see are all relational, they all involve us directly in a reciprocal relationship, is about unrecognised contribution. The poor are not just there doing nothing. They are contributing. They are good parents very largely. They're good neighbours. They're engaged in society. They're surviving, sometimes together. They're underpinning our affluence by the low wages that they are living on. Their contribution is unrecognised. they teach each other, they clear up the rubbish. We look down upon them in the sculpture. But at the heart of poverty is suffering in body, heart and mind. Reintroducing the word suffering into the centre of the equation. We don't use the notion of victim and victimisation, it's not politically correct. But suffering is what people wanted to talk about. But it wasn't suffering necessarily that was passive, that denied agency. There was struggle, the process of survival, driven by necessity, but also using those skills which were unrecognised, skills which aren't accredited, skills which go for blind in our society. And linking all the 9 dimensions together was this notion of disempowerment, the invisible, the voiceless, where my life is in somebody else's hands, was at the core of this experience. Now, there is no mention of shame here, but it strikes me that these relational dimensions are in many ways all speaking about the experience of shame. And they're what poverty is, according to the people who experience it, and those dimensions are never measured, or very seldom measured, and are certainly not in the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I have already had my 20 minutes.
Take 3 or 4 more?
3 or 4 more. Thank you. These dimensions are nuanced. They differ somewhat according to location, urban, rural. They're nuanced by time, short spells versus long spells. They're nuanced by identity, intersectionality is critical, and also environmental factors. And at the bottom is culture and beliefs. And I want that to connect me with the last 3 minutes, which is thinking about the mediation of poverty and shame by culture. The first piece of research, in a sense, questioned whether culture was important, and subsequent writing, stimulated by our work, has raised the question of whether culture does nuance the connection between poverty or shame, or indeed destroy it. And I'm now going to talk about China. And I'm going to talk about 2 studies in China, both of which deal with Dibao. Dibao is the world's largest social assistance system, the sort of equivalent of universal credit, if you like. It goes to 60 million people. And these are 2 separate studies conducted in villages. The first, a set of qualitative interviews undertaken in Shaanxi, and the second set in an undesignated province in southwest China. Doing research in China that is any sense risks the possibility of being critical is really difficult. So confidentiality is quite important in this process. Okay, on the basis of this, I just want to briefly recap on what shame is in the West. The notion of a social emotion, internal and external, I've said. That its function, well, its outcome is to hurt, but its function is often presented as a way of inculcating social norms. We threaten people through the risk of shaming to encourage them to do what society expects them to do. So it's instrumental in a way, and it's about behaviour. In China, shame takes a rather different view. It is actually central to the human experience as the human experience is conceptualised in China. Individual without a sense of shame is no longer human, is what Mencius, an early follower of Confucius, argued. And then we have the notion of shame in terms of governance with Confucius, where really he is arguing that regulation causes people to avoid those regulations shamelessly. But if you don't govern people by laws and regulation but through moral force and through ritual, then you avoid shame. You avoid the need for shame because the risk of shame encourages behaviour, and behaviour is good, and therefore you don't have to shame people, is the logic. And within the notion of shame, crucially important, there are 118 or something like that, different characters for shame in Chinese. It's quite subtle. Is the notion of face. And within face, there are two really important components. Mian, which is about reputation, and Lian, which is much more about living out the fulfillments of your moral obligations. It's about integrity. And so I'm going to play with those a little bit. And now I'm going to go through 3 eras of Chinese history. So I'm going to start with Confucius. And Confucius argued that a well-governed society is a society without poverty. So the responsibility, the shame that attaches to poverty, attaches to governors, to the emperor, not to the individual. But what the individual has is the ability to demonstrate their integrity, their morality, their lian, by living a good life when poor despite those circumstances. So you don't steal, you are a good citizen. You don't rebel either. So you have this system of enforcing social control. So those 2 elements go together. Mao saw poverty as a result of exploitation. Again, a typo here. People in poverty, in Mao's sense, were at the vanguard of the continuing revolution. The poor were making a sacrifice for the well-being of the future of China. So they were placed in the spotlight as positive. And indeed, in the early stages of the Chinese Republic, resources went on quite a large scale. It often meant that the former landowners lost all their resources and normally their lives as well. So it was a pretty ruthless exercise, but essentially the poor were placed in the middle. And this notion of poor and blank, which is a rather horrible expression in English, is this notion that people in poverty have nothing to lose. They're the only group in society who have nothing to lose. And they're the ones who can drive forward the revolution. And so Mao placed people in poverty right at the heart of governance, right as the leaders of the revolution. And then we had the socialist market economy. On the one hand, under Mao, poverty was glorious. In the market economy, wealth is glorious. To be rich is glorious. Indeed, Deng Xiaoping actually is attributed to saying that. Everybody assumes he said it, but I've not found anybody who can prove where he said it. But it's part of the collective understanding of what actually happened during that period of time. And we also have a situation where to be a Chinese citizen is to become rich. And we have a current discourse, by the way, where people aren't prepared to become rich enough quickly enough. And there's a process of cultural re-education being put in place to change that. Okay, so income is rewarded with high mian, high face, poverty with lower mian. It doesn't matter how you get rich as long as you get rich. It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it's a cat and is rich. And the findings that come from this in the present are as predicted on that previous slide, or as a result of our analysis at the level of theory and scholarship, that to be poor is to be shameful, but eating on Dibao is glorious, and that's the mystery. So let me just quickly finish. First of all, by cutting through the qualitative research, and there we are. Here's a slide that you find difficult. Proportion of people thinking that poverty is due to laziness. We find the American influenced countries right at the top, and we find China pretty well close to the top as well. Now I can demonstrate what that means in real life through qualitative research, but I'm not going to because of my time horizon. So poverty is really shameful because laziness is shameful, because the Chinese citizen should never be lazy and every Chinese citizen should be rich. That is the future of China. Dibao. Most social assistance systems around the world are stigmatised because they inherit the stigma of poverty, and because we deliberately, in many cases, deliberately make them stigmatising as a way of rationing our expenditure on people in poverty. In China, It doesn't appear to be the case in rural areas. People are grateful. That society has seen me as worthy to spend money on. Back to the notion of Confucius, the people at the top of society are there because they are more moral than those at the bottom. We don't challenge those at the top because their morality has me at heart. That's what morality is. That's how we build a society. But there are more practical reasons as well as that. In Shanxi, 90% of the money doesn't reach the poor. It's being turned into a universal pension. We don't make divisions between rich and poor in Shanxi province. We recognise that old age is sometimes associated with poverty, but filial piety says the younger generation should look after the older generation, and there aren't that many in the younger generation because of one-child policy. So the state helping us to do that is great. So that is the total antithesis of what national policy suggests, which is very selective, very focused, very divisive. It's approved of because of social control, because people are happy in the villages that one day they will receive it. In Guangzhou, if you're a good citizen, you'll get dibao. If you're poor, you're highly unlikely, unless you're so clearly poor that an official visiting from the county will see you. Otherwise, you don't. So, here we have a situation where social assistance isn't tarnished by being associated with poverty, received by people in poverty, because the benefit designed to address poverty doesn't get there. And so we have a situation where we can begin to understand how, on the one hand, in a market economy, where individual citizens are failing to be good citizens because they are poor, and are therefore stigmatised and shamed. But they can receive, well, they don't receive dibao, that's the problem. People receive dibao, which is not stigmatising. And, believe it or not, the official figures for the proportion of people receiving dibao who are poor in China, proportion of people receiving dibao who are poor is 20%. The remaining 80% are not poor, according to the criteria used in the specification of dibao. So I'm arguing that poverty is ubiquitous, that it hurts, it doesn't achieve changes in behaviour, that it pervades the experience of poverty. And yes, it is mediated by culture, because I think it was different in the era of Mao. I don't know whether it was better. We can talk about that later. But thank you, and apologies for going on too long.
Thank you. Thank you. We can return to some of those really interesting points in our discussion. But we'll move on to our second speaker. So I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Felicity Thomas. She's a senior research fellow at the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health and co-director of the WHO Collaborating Centre on Culture and Health. Her recent ESRC-funded study examined the impacts of austerity and welfare reform on mental health in low-income communities, and questioned the relevance of current government drives to increase common mental health treatments, like antidepressants and talking therapies for poverty-related distress. So Felicity will use some findings from the De-Stress Project to examine how narratives of self-responsibility become embodied within people's daily lives when they intersect with systems of welfare support. Thank you.
Thanks, Luna. And apologies, I'm using notes. I've got to do another very different talk for a very different audience tomorrow, so my head's a bit muddled at the moment. So, as Luna says, I'm going to talk about poverty, shame and mental health in austerity Britain. Now, poor working class neighbourhoods and the people within them have long been the subject of public scrutiny, judgment and media scorn. The narratives that get used to demean the poor have long been deployed by a series of governments in the UK from across the political spectrum, from notions of an underclass during the Thatcher era to the language of exclusion under Blair, and more recently under the Coalition and current Conservative government, to adages relating to a broken and lost country that requires punitive changes to welfare in order to restore economic order. Now, underpinning all these kind of narratives has been what Steph Lawler calls a narrative of lack. in which usually white working class people are seen by others, so middle classes, politicians and the media, not only to lack material resources, but also to be deficient in things like taste and knowledge and what Bourdieu calls the right ways of being and doing. This kind of thinking is very clearly evident in a range of characters that have emerged in UK popular culture that kind of typify the prejudices commonly expressed against poor or working class people. So if you think of Little Britain's Vicky Pollard, Shameless' Frank Gallagher, for example, they incite disgust by propping up stereotypes of dysfunctionality and recklessness, a message that's also very clearly conveyed in the proliferation of reality television programmes like Channel 4's Benefit Street, Channel 5's On Benefits and Proud, and of course the lovely Jeremy Kyle show. Now, opportunities for this kind of vitriol and stereotype have really been amplified under austerity, where a lot of the focus of this assumed lack or deficit is centred around notions of self-responsibility. And this can be reflected, this can be seen reflected in neoliberal orientations and goals that increasingly restrict entitlement to welfare, to address what George Osborne as Chancellor described as an entrenched something-for-nothing culture, in which people in receipt of benefits are seen to shamelessly expect to be provided for whilst others go out to work. Now, in a context in which success is largely measured through personal economic achievement, these narratives then fuel a situation in which those experiencing poverty and disadvantage become cast as moral failures, denied recognition and seen as devoid of value and worth. And as Robert Walker here has argued himself, rendering welfare as a term of abuse has also helped facilitate a range of reforms that have led to wide-scale reductions in entitlements across the UK in recent years. So amongst other things, this includes a cap on the benefits available to an individual or a household, the introduction of a very controversial so-called simplified payment benefit system through the rollout of universal credit, and the imposition of the bedroom tax, whereby people living in social housing that's deemed to surpass their basic needs now have to pay for any spare bedrooms within their property. Now, none of these narratives are new. They're not unique at all. But what is different is that they're being played out at the moment alongside broader changes in the conceptualisation and treatment of common mental health issues. And by this we mean depression and anxiety. And the provision of effective treatment and support for mental health is a stated aim of our government, and can be seen reflected in the sharp upsurge of antidepressant prescribing and referrals to talking therapies in the past decade. So just to give you a bit of an idea, in England the number of antidepressants prescribed more than doubled from 33.7 million in 2006 to over 70 million prescriptions last year. And we can see on this map here the very high levels of antidepressant prescribing in economically disadvantaged areas, so that's the red areas. Now, of course, one reading of this trend could be that government-provided mental health services are actually successfully challenging the inverse care law by ensuring that widely recommended treatments are available for everybody who needs them. So that's one take on it. However, there's growing concern that these changes are part of an increasing trend towards the pathologisation of everyday stresses of life lived in hardship. Now, framing this kind of poverty-related mental distress as a mental health condition that lies within the individual concerned has a series of really important and potentially detrimental repercussions. Firstly, it implies that distress caused by the everyday challenges of poverty can be corrected through medical or therapeutic intervention. Secondly, it actually masks the factors that often underlie the root causes of the suffering, so things like poor living conditions, unemployment and social isolation. And thirdly, of course, it reiterates stereotypical assumptions and negative narratives around the behaviour of people living in poverty, whilst absolving those in power from taking responsibility from the injustices caused by ongoing economic, social and health inequalities. We also need to bear in mind that evidence suggests that antidepressants have a very low effect size. People kind of assume that they work, but actually only 1 in 8 people who take antidepressants actually have any desired outcomes from this. At the same time, antidepressants are known to have adverse side effects, and it can be very harmful side effects. And there's actually very little evidence on the health impacts of long-term use. In fact, what evidence there is actually suggests that long-term use can actually exacerbate and worsen mental health conditions. So one of the things that I was really interested in was looking at this intersection between mental health and welfare strategies and how this focus on self-responsibility and associated welfare reform strategies were then impacting on mental health and well-being of people living in economic hardship. So some of the key points I kind of want to get across today are that moral narratives around self and self-responsibility inflict and exacerbate shame and mental distress, yet they're also becoming naturalised and normalised within society, often including within economically poor communities themselves. This in turn can increase the potential for the medicalisation of poverty-related distress. But I also, like Robert, want to emphasise that people can resist these kinds of narratives, and we'll talk briefly at the end about the kind of consequences that is having for people. Now, I want to kind of frame this discussion very loosely on Bourdieu's ideas around cultural capital, habitus and taste, and the associated notion of symbolic violence. I don't want to get too bogged down in any of this here, but just to say that symbolic violence refers to the socio-cultural mechanisms and relations of unequal power that exist within interpersonal relations and that manifest in everyday life through language, symbolism, and through the actions of normal routines and relations. Now, Bourdieu argues that this kind of symbolic domination is everywhere. It's embedded in everyday life in a way that means that even those who have the most to lose from the dominant power hierarchy participate to some extent in reproducing their own subjection. Now, this is partly, he argues, because the voices of poor people are so hard to hear, but it's also because when they speak to the dominant group, they have to use a borrowed language, a borrowed discourse, which is the very discourse that those dominating offer about them. Now, this kind of what he calls consent and complicity in their own subjugation is then experienced in a way that makes it feel natural and legitimate, even when it leaves people feeling insignificant and shamed. And I'm going to talk today about how this plays out under austerity. Now, we also know that many of the biological processes that lead to ill health are stimulated by what people think and feel about their material and social circumstances. And there's growing evidence to show that this can be especially negative when people feel belittled or degraded. And when people perceive the value of their worth so negatively, it influences the likelihood of them excluding themselves from public life, as well as increasing the triggering of biological stress responses. So this, of course, raises key questions over the ways that people conceive of this mental distress that they're feeling. And what we're interested in is how people can respond, or how people are responding to that kind of mental distress. So, which brings me on to the project itself. So briefly, the aims of the De-Stress project were to look at how welfare reforms, austerity and poverty and welfare-related rhetoric were affecting mental health in low-income communities, how antidepressants and talking therapies are actually being used in these communities, the kinds of challenges facing GPs who are trying to support these patients, and also what good practice in supporting these patients might look like. And I'm going to focus today on the first three, and in particular looking at how symbolic violence becomes naturalised within low-income communities and within clinical practice in the broader current climate of treatment normalisation. So this was a 2.5-year study. It's just ended. It took an interdisciplinary and engaged research approach involving project stakeholders at all stages of the project. So like with Robert's project, we involved people living in poverty at every stage of this project. It was really, really crucial in helping us to frame the questions we were asking, interpret our data. The community partners made films about their experiences of going to a GP. They've also been involved in disseminating this work through conferences and through the media as well. We carried out focus groups and interviews in the study sites to understand lived experiences of poverty-related distress. We interviewed GPs to understand how they perceive and respond to this. We undertook conversation analysis of video recorded mental health consultations, and we held workshops with health practitioners to talk through our findings and to start to develop resource materials for GPs working in low-income communities. Now, underpinning, before I sort of look at the findings itself, I just want to talk briefly about some of the narratives that underpin these findings. And we found there were three core types of narrative that influenced the way people experienced and responded to poverty-related mental distress. First, a neoliberal narrative where people with distress are seen as having social behavioural problems that they need to sort out themselves. And we found that this narrative very often leads to people feeling guilty and helpless. a shame narrative where people who are not seen to be acting responsibly or seem to be engaging in reckless and irresponsible behaviour, which makes them be seen as a problem both to themselves and to society more generally. And this led to a fear of people being judged and actually the avoidance of help seeking. And we also have a medicalisation narrative where mental distress is seen as a pathological issue requiring medical intervention. And what we saw in the research was the kind of chaos that these narratives, either alone or in combination, start to cause both for patients and doctors as they try to find responses to the very real stresses of what are essentially social and structural issues. So we found a huge amount of evidence to demonstrate how narratives reinforcing a failure of individual responsibility were being played out and embodied within people's everyday lives. In discussions with representatives from key support agencies and statutory organisations, for example, we commonly heard comments that saw people living in poverty as witting players in their own plight, through assertions like, oh, they're not bothering to help themselves, or that their situation of precarity was directly linked to their chaotic and irresponsible lifestyle, or as one professional beautifully put it, that they obviously got something out of being depressed. Now, such comments in turn fed into this sort of broader and persistent narrative of blame in which people are continually exposed to their perceived inadequacies and their alleged failure to take responsibility for themselves and their family. And of course this unceasing reminder from service providers and statutory organisations that they were lucky to be given anything. Now, receiving state welfare or other forms of more localised support, such as using food banks, carries with it a really hefty burden of shame and stigma. But for most participants in the research, the distress this elicited was not caused by a reliance on this kind of assistance per se, but because people were constantly made to feel that they were undeserving of that support. And participants explained this was particularly apparent when dealing with job centre advisors, where unless you were lucky to have an understanding key worker, the norm was to feel disbelieved, seen as scum, and blamed for the smallest misdemeanours, or more commonly for systemic failures and delays that clearly fell outside of their control. Now, the enforced and regularised nature of these kinds of interactions meant that people's experiences as failures were frequently reiterated in their everyday lives, and significantly undermined people's self-worth. Yet even attempts to improve themselves by keeping well, looking after their appearance, or giving themselves an occasional treat were felt to be a brash overindulgence that would be harshly judged by others and undermined any claim to be considered worthy recipients of support. So you can see in this first quote here, this lady saying she's really struggling with her depression. She just wants to go away just for a cheap weekend by the sea somewhere. And she says, but if I do that, I'm going to be judged, aren't I? Because I've spent my money that way. And people won't see it as me trying to get myself well. They'll just see it as me being irresponsible. We also found that discourse around poverty-related shame is very often gendered, and other people have found this as well. It emphasises embodied deficiencies that often relate to dress, weight and complexion, and they're predicated on an implied behavioural faults such as excess drinking or poor diet. This discourse also relates to how money is spent, with attempts by people to avoid shame being considered respectable or protect their children by buying particular accessories or items of clothing, often being mocked or openly disapproved of by other people. And women in particular felt that they were very judicially harsh, as you can see in that second quote there. And despite the very clearly negative impact of these narratives, we found abundant evidence of people actually embodying the mental distress of the narratives of blame and failure to which they were exposed. So in both these quotes here, people explain how turning to the welfare system at a time of crisis was regarded as a sign of personal weakness and failure. So the first person says, you've become one of them, one of those people who do that, sit on the dole all their life sort of people. And Tony, who says, the pressure, I somehow failed, I just wasn't good enough. And consenting to these dominant narratives around their failures, participants commonly dissociated themselves from those seen as scroungers or as undeserving, and subscribed to this dominant rhetoric that both denied the existence of real poverty, whilst also morally condemning the poor. And as a result, they sort of help enable and perpetuate the very narratives by which they, the poor, are being subjugated. We can see in the quotes here that a further outcome of this complicity was the reluctance of some people to actually involve themselves in the welfare system, even when they were entitled to receive support, precisely because they didn't want to be perceived by other people as the type of person who would have to resort to this form of support. And they didn't want to put themselves in a position where they were going to feel open to judgment. So people actually explaining how they just try desperately not to be in the welfare system because they don't want to be part of that sort of scrounger rhetoric. Now, the complexities of engaging in the welfare system also acted as a form of violence in itself, and that really affected people's mental health, particularly when the system that we currently have endorses a guilty until proven innocent approach to assessing claimants, and when claimants have to go to extreme lengths to prove their worthiness. And it's all made much, much harder by the fact that everything's now digital by default, which means that people can't actually access things very easily anyway. People have to travel on public transport to get to appointments. Appointments often get cancelled. No one remembers to tell people. You also have to sort of present a work-ready psychology in job centres these days. If you're not seen as being work-ready, then you're punished for that. And at the same time, people were also shamed by the idiosyncrasies of the welfare system itself. Mistakes in benefits or benefit sanctioning, which left people without basic payments, for example, and the imposition of universal credit, which meant people have a very lengthy wait for their first payment, actually left people feeling really humiliated because they were left in a situation where they had to choose whether they bought toothpaste or toilet roll, whether they had food or got heating. You know, these were very, very real decisions people had to make because the system wasn't working. And the work capability assessment itself, which is absolutely horrific, was a really key source of stress. This is a process that's done by someone who's normally unfamiliar to the person, has no knowledge of them or their background, and they're forced to go through a humiliating and traumatising set of questioning and exercises that were usually completely inappropriate to assess mental health. They're set up to assess physical rather than mental health. People are forced to retell their story and really justify their inabilities to work. And when they have GP evidence to back up their claims, it's very often completely ignored in these kinds of assessments. We also found parents of young children themselves investing in or perpetuating broader narratives that question their sanity and ability to cope. Here, high levels of distress were in large part caused by the difficulties of raising children in poor quality, often overcrowded housing with little available capital to purchase basic things like food or good quality food, or to engage in social or leisure activities. Yet despite the often positive intentions of service providers, the context of risk management and surveillance that dominates now the provision of a lot of social support in this country means that these interactions frequently become dominated by discussions that question the lifestyle and actions of the parents, rather than identifying how best the service can actually help those parents. And this left parents increasingly questioning their ability to be good parents. Now, under austerity, we've seen the closure of key social infrastructures and the rundown of community. So things like libraries, CABs, that kind of thing, have closed down. People have been moved out of the communities that they're familiar with into sort of other social housing. And what this means is that GP surgeries are now one of the few places left for people to actually go to get help. And of course, by the very nature as clinical settings, the chances of poverty-related distress becoming medicalised are going to be vastly increased. Now, of course, it can be helpful for people to have a diagnosis. We're not denying that. But we also found that many people felt pressure to legitimise their distress. And when constantly being blamed for the circumstances and told how lucky they were to have anything, there was this implication that people who were experiencing the challenges of poverty should see any associated distress they felt as a problem that lay within their own pathology, rather than an issue that lay within the structural inequalities they faced. So people were actively encouraged to seek medical help by their friends and family, or themselves that had invested in these narratives around the normalcy and need to act upon themselves as if they were ill and in need of treatment. Of course, it's really important to bear in mind that medicalisation is actually necessary these days in order to qualify for a lot of welfare. So you have to have a diagnosis in order to get welfare. People felt they had to be seen to be taking control of their lives, either by keeping quiet, not bothering anyone, or by adhering to what they were told by their GP. this may involve being prescribed medications, even if they didn't then want to take them, like you can see in the quote here. And there was a very broad feeling that if you weren't seen as trying to help yourself, then you were in some way defective and less deserving. Now, of course, the very fact that qualifying for some of the key forms of welfare requires people to evidence some form of legitimate health concern raises really important ethical questions over the ways in which people are encouraged to accept a sick role in order to justify and obtain support. And like I say, there was evidence that people were engaging with medicalising and pathologising terminology to explain and legitimise their experiences of distress. And this kind of language was then reinforced and normalised through their interactions with GPs, and usually led to the prescription of antidepressants or talking therapies. GPs themselves explained how frustrated they were, that they'd become caught up in politically driven agendas around welfare entitlements. And most GPs reported they needed to try and protect their patients from the fallout of this. Now, this could be through helping patients complete welfare admin forms, but more commonly it manifested through the proffering of a mental health diagnosis and treatment to enable the patient to help them evidence their welfare claims, even in cases where the GP didn't really see the issue as medical, like the GP here is. And I'll say this is what I'm going to put on the form, but I know in my heart of hearts it's not actually a medical problem. Now, GPs clearly had good intentions to support their patients, but a number of factors worked together to ensure that these inequalities were reproduced and became normalised within the consultation room. Firstly, GPs are trained to recognise behavioural factors in health as they relate to issues like lifestyle and diet. GPs are also generally trained in this country to diagnose between either physical or mental health issues, rather than recognise the interconnections between them and bringing in social factors as well. So without being trained to see the unequal economic structures and societal prejudices that shape the suffering of their patients, some health professionals tend to see mental distress as caused by either pathological issues related to brain dysfunction or as caused by the patient's behaviour and lifestyle. And this in turn leads to responses that promote what are often ineffective and potentially harmful medical treatments through antidepressants, or that blame patient distress on feckless and irresponsible behaviour, without acknowledging the inequalities that cause that distress in the first place. And that such actions, of course, in turn inadvertently depoliticise suffering and in turn reinforce and naturalise the very structures that uphold and reproduce oppression, again resulting in the core determinants of distress going unacknowledged and unaddressed. Even when GPs in the study did recognise the social and structural determinants of distress, the pressures faced to help a patient within a very short time slot of a consultation, and a sense there was very little they could actually do to alleviate the suffering and what they saw as a hopeless situation, tended to lead to a medicalised response. So this is one of my favourite quotes from the whole project, this top one. And I think the perception is that certainly amongst GPs, something like fluoxetine it's a very safe, fairly clean drug, won't do very much harm, so it feels like a kind thing to do. If you've got somebody in a situation that can't be changed, prescribe them with medication, makes them feel slightly better about their situation. Not good evidence to support it, but we still do it. And the second one basically says the same thing. You feel like you should try to give somebody something. So GPs are recognising they can't actually fix people's problems, but they want somebody to leave their consultation feeling a little bit better, that somebody's trying to give them something. There was also evidence to suggest that GP responses to patients experiencing poverty-related distress were mediated through perceived differences in the capabilities of their patients. So whilst acknowledging that antidepressants have a small effect size, some GPs explained how people from low-income backgrounds would cope better with antidepressants than they would with talking therapies, the latter requiring a level of emotional labour and commitment that they didn't feel reassured that the patient would be capable of giving. Any harmful side effects from the medications were therefore moderated and justified by a perceived lack of ability amongst patients to commit properly to alternative options. And once prescribed these medications, of course, what we found is that people were left on them for many, many years at a time, sometimes decades, with what they felt was very little opportunity to review that medication or to stop taking or help to stop taking it. Now, sorry, I've probably been talking for ages, so I'll just finish fairly quickly. Now, of course, some people do resist these dominant narratives. They're very, very pervasive and powerful, but people do resist them as well, and in so doing try to resist some of the shame associated with them. Now, like I say, Bourdieu's notion of symbolic violence does provide a helpful lens through which to understand how poverty-related mental distress becomes normalised and medicalised. Yet in all of his work, he presents an overwhelmingly bleak picture of working-class agency and culture, and doesn't really pay much attention to the ways that people might resist or repurpose these narratives and social hierarchies to which they're exposed. Now, symbolic violence isn't always easy to recognise until it's been going on for some time, or until a person takes themselves out of the relationship concerned, particularly when that relationship is, on the surface at least, meant to be one grounded in support and care. What we found in the research was that over time, many parents in particular had responded to the frameworks of risk in which they were being judged by entirely removing themselves from the systems that were in theory meant to support them. Now, of course, you could argue that doing this out of fear, removing themselves from systems out of fear, is itself a form of symbolic violence. Yet at the same time, parents we spoke with explained that removing themselves from this system enabled them to take responsibility in a way that they felt gave them more control, helped them to resist the ongoing judgment and moralising that they felt they were being subjected to, and it made them feel safer in terms of preventing opportunities for their children to be removed into statutory care. In other cases, participants repurposed the notion of responsibility in a way they felt distanced them from external judgment and shaming by surrounding themselves with a very tight-knit social network which they felt they could identify. And a key characteristics of these kind of self-organising informal support groups was actually their refusal to operate as official third sector groups, in some cases deliberately not seeking external funding so that they could avoid bureaucracy and the requirement to tick boxes which they felt spoke really to somebody else's middle class, usually deficits-oriented agenda. While these kind of groups offered a degree of buffering from societal judgment and scorn, we found that these forms of support manifested in diverse ways with very different implications for the way people defined and experienced their mental health. So one group of women, for example, who met on a social basis were united not only in their backgrounds and experiences, but by their conviction that their distress did have a medical basis and that antidepressants were helping them to cope with and gain control over their lives. Meanwhile, members of another women's group in the same locality actually rebuffed the medicalisation of their distress, in some instances after being on antidepressants for a number of years, and they'd found alternative ways to live well through, for example, encouraging each other to share their experiences and to exercise and eat well and so on. And just sort of wanted to bring that in just to point out that these kind of things, it's worth moving beyond Bourdieu's notion of symbolic violence and what he's saying there, where he basically denies agency to everybody, to actually recognise that some of these other alternative resisting narratives can be very useful in when we think about what we could be doing instead. There's a summary there which I won't go through because I think I've probably been talking far too long. Thank you. I hope that made sense.
Thank you so much. So our final speaker is Lucy Hodges, and Lucy has worked in professional services at the University of Exeter for the past 6 years, most recently as the acting centre manager for the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health. And she will speak about her lived experience of debt, mental health, and working with the UK debt charity Christians Against Poverty.
Am I positioned right? Okay. Right. Well, set the timer, got 20 minutes, off I go. So yes, I'm here to talk about my experience with being in debt and about the process of going through asking for help and getting help from a debt charity. And I think a lot of the things I'm going to say are simply going to prove the points that Robert and Felicity have made so brilliantly already this afternoon, in that it was quite a shameful experience and it was very difficult, and I felt a huge amount of personal responsibility and as a huge failure for being in debt and needing to ask for help. And partly because of that, because I felt such shame and a sense of failure about it, is why I decided I would stand up here today and talk to you about it loudly, obnoxiously, and with coloured slides, so that it might just start a dialogue for people to feel slightly less ashamed and talk about their own debt problems. So that was my main thought. And I've called my talk Avocado Toast because This is a headline from May 2017, where a millionaire told millennials, which is my generation, sort of early 80s to early 2000s birth years, if you want a house, stop buying avocado toast. And his remark was that young people eat avocado toast out in cafes for breakfast, and that if they didn't do that and they instead put that money towards saving for a house deposit, they would be able to afford to buy a house in today's current economic climate. I did the maths for buying a house in Exeter. I'd have to not eat £40,000 worth of avocado toast to get a house deposit in Exeter, and I don't think I've eaten £40,000 worth of avocado toast in my life, never mind as an adult. So I've called it avocado toast for this reason. So I wanted to talk about getting into debt. The dictionary defines debt as something owed, especially money. My debt problem started when I was at university. I had a maintenance loan, but it barely covered the basics, and so I also had a part-time job, and my parents also made a contribution, but it still wasn't actually enough money to make ends meet. Now, I will admit I went to university at Oxford, so my rent was very expensive, and I did an English degree, so my books cost around £150 a module, and I did 8 modules a year. So I had an expensive degree programme, but it was, you know, I have feelings about the whole university maintenance loan, wasn't enough, blah, blah, blah. But when I went to the bank and said, I'm doing a degree, I'm going to become a student, they said, oh, fantastic, let me give you an interest-free overdraft of £2,000. Oh, brilliant, okay, thanks, that'd be really useful, I could definitely use that. And they said, oh, by the way, you can also have a student credit card, which is not quite as much, but, you know, the interest rate is a bit lower. And I was like, are you sure? Because I don't have an income. And they were like, yeah, no, it's fine. When you're a graduate, you'll be fine. Okay then, so off I go with my overdraft and my student credit card and the beginnings of my debt. And when I was doing this talk, when Luna asked me to speak, I decided that I would look up why do people get into debt. I would Google it just to see what the internet said. And I came across this quote. There are several reasons we accumulate debt, like paying for unforeseen emergencies or unemployment. But most often, debt is a result of bad spending habits, because unless you're spending cash, it's costing you money to spend money. And I wondered if that was true of my debt problem. So let's have a look. This is what my debt looked like. And at first, when you look at it, you think, yeah, that looks like bad spending habits. That seems fair. But when you look at the data, it is actually bad spending habits. Yeah, that's fair. But actually, although my overdraft is a hangover from my student days, I didn't get any of this debt by making what I would describe as irresponsible spending choices. All of that overdraft, all of that credit card was spent on living expenses. It was spent on buying food, it was spent on paying bills, it was spent on repairs on my car so I could get to work. And none of it was steak dinner and designer handbags. It was all just a very practical set of living expenses that I simply couldn't afford on the wages that I was earning. So, although this debt looks, you know, credit cards and store cards look, to use that term, you know, irresponsible, like a personal failure. The store cards were clothes I bought so that I didn't go to work in rags, and the credit cards were things I had bought so I could buy food and put petrol in my car to get to work. And the overdraft was a hangover from my student loan, my student days, where I'd had to buy books for my degree. And the utility arrears were bills on my flat that I was living in that I just couldn't afford to make the monthly payments on. So I graduated from my first degree in 2008, which was smack bang in the middle of a global financial crisis. I'm sure many of you remember it. It's stayed with us all for a very long time, and it's led to austerity, which Felicity was talking about. When I went off to university, I signed up for university, I was told, when you graduate, you'll get a really great job. Don't worry about it, it'll be fine. And when I went off to university, that was true. The job market was booming, there were loads of opportunities. There was no reason to suspect that going off and starting to study for a degree wouldn't lead to reasonable and sustainable employment in the long term. And then there was a global financial crisis, and all the jobs that the people who did the same sort of degree as me were getting disappeared. And when I graduated, I could get part-time work. I had, I think, 3 part-time jobs when I graduated the first time. And that didn't add up to a living wage, working 3 part-time jobs. Eventually I did get a full-time job, but that didn't pay the wage that one might have reasonably expected to earn with the level of qualifications that I had when I first decided to go to university. And actually what that meant was, even though I got a full-time job, there were stagnating wages because the economy couldn't sustain an increase of salary in line with the cost of living. So my wages stagnated for 5 or 6 years. The increase, I worked it out, over 6 years, my salary increased in take-home terms by about £200 in total, but my rent increased by £170 and my council tax by £50. So even just council tax and rent were £220, which was £20 more than how much my salary went up by. So I was on a losing wicket to start with. But that didn't occur to me at the time. At the time, I was just moving money from one pot to another and making payments and hoping to God this wasn't going to be the month that the bailiffs knocked on the door and took something away to pay the bills I couldn't afford to pay. I also had the really bad misfortune to become really poorly. About 7 years ago, I discovered that I had hyperthyroidism, and I had to have a total thyroidectomy, so I had my thyroid removed, and that gave me a chronic lifelong condition that meant even if I wanted to get a second job, I was too tired at the end of the workday to get a second job, so I had no way of increasing my earning power in the circumstances I was in. I also had major depression, major clinical depression, partly as a result of the thyroid problem, but also because I was in a situation that was really depressing. Like, it was perhaps medicalising my poverty, my debt, but also that's just how it was. I was living in a flat I couldn't afford, working a job that was undervaluing my skills, although I really enjoyed it, and I was poorly. It was not a fun time, but there is good news on the horizon, everybody. So in 2017, my finances are, and you may insert your word of choice here, I have tried to be reasonably polite. My take-home salary is about £1,400 a month, and these are my sort of outgoings that are £1,200 a month. So on the first of the month, my salary comes in, and immediately £1,200 goes out, leaving me with £200 for everything else I need to spend my money on that month. Now, on here you can see I've got credit card payment and overdraft payment of about £225, which was great. I was meeting those payments, but what it also meant was that the moment I'd made those payments, I was using that money for living costs, because there was no way for me to survive on £200 a month. I really like eating as well as keeping a roof over my head, so I just, I ended up using that money. Now that meant that even though I was paying that money towards my debt every month, my debt was never changing or getting smaller because it was never decreasing. Now, by this point, in 2017, I'm at breaking point. My depression is worse, my health is worse, I am exhibiting some really odd behaviours. I couldn't open my post. I couldn't open any piece of post that was sent to me because I was so convinced it was all going to be a bill that wanted more money from me. I couldn't answer my phone. I couldn't make phone calls because I was sure it was going to be someone ringing me up to tell me they needed money from me. I couldn't check my bank balance because I was so sure it would be in the red and it would have negative figures, and the bank would then phone me up and tell me that I owed them money. And every time I needed an unexpected expense, which was basically anything that wasn't on that list I showed you on the previous slide, I had to borrow money off someone, which actually socially is really difficult because you're asking your friends to lend you money and you start to feel like a burden. You start to feel like somebody who is taking and not giving. You mentioned you can't go to the pub, you can't afford to stand around with drinks, and actually you find yourself not wanting to put yourself in the position of having to say, I can't afford that, or I don't want to do that, or can you lend me 20 quid because I've run out of money this month, I know it's only the 10th of the month. And the overall effect was, I don't know if you can see the background, but it's basically a woman with her head in her hands, and that's how I felt all the time. It meant that although I was still holding down my job and I was going to work every day, at evenings and weekends I just wasn't going out. I wasn't taking care of myself. I was neglecting my self-care. I was neglecting looking after my flat. My mum used to come round and say to me, like, well, you just try having a shower and I'll do the washing up. And she'd sort of open the kitchen door and there'd be like 2 weeks worth of washing up, and she'd be like, have a shower and then maybe watch something on the TV, as she'd like go in to start the process of cleaning up after me. And I honestly don't think I could have survived without that additional help because I just didn't have it in me to take care of myself. So at that time, so we're talking first 6 months of 2017, it gets to the middle of 2017 and I get this email. Now this is the final straw. I don't know if you can read it. Basically it says, we recently carried out a review of your flow account to check how much energy you have been using and how much you have been paying. As a result of this, we are changing your direct debit from £93 a month to £124 a month to make sure you continue to pay the right amount. Now I was living in a 1-bedroom flat and I had no idea why my utility bill was £93 a month already, but this broke me. I don't really remember what happened after I read this email first thing in the morning, but I remember literally standing up and holding my hands up and going, I can't do this anymore. Now I was at work at the time, so my boss was a little bit freaked out by the fact that I had just stood up and declared I was done, and was obviously understandably relieved when he found out that it was in fact my personal financial situation I was talking about and not my job. My colleagues were amazing actually. They peeled me off the ceiling, sat me down, made me a cup of coffee and said, okay, tell us what's going on. And they were pretty horrified by this too. They didn't understand how I'd got to this situation where it's costing me £125 a month in electricity. And they also agreed when I said, I can't do this anymore. They said, no, you can't. You have to stop. Something in this is not right. Something has to change. So I sat there kind of in a state of shock for the rest of the day, and I thought, I can't live in this flat on my own anymore. And that for me was a huge step because I was living, I'm single, I lived on my own, I was single then, and I had my own flat that I paid for myself. I was an independent woman, I paid for my own bills, and to decide and to realise that that was causing me this much distress was really difficult. To give up that sense of independence and that recognition that I had worked so hard to be independent was something I really struggled with. But I went home to my parents' house and I told them that the weight of my debt was crushing me. I couldn't do it anymore. I think that conversation with them was more upsetting for them than for me, because by that point I'd gone, hey, this can't go on anymore, I've got to change. I'd had a few hours to get used to the idea. Whereas they were hearing me say, I've decided to give up, I've decided to not live in my flat on my own anymore. But I was really lucky in that they were hugely supportive and agreed they would help me with anything I needed. And then we sat there and we looked up rooms on shared accommodation, and so I made the decision I would stop living in a flat on my own and I would move in and be a lodger in someone else's house. And that was really difficult because I was in my late 20s, I was used to being on my own and having my own space, but I knew that I couldn't carry on the way I was, and so therefore something had to change. And I was in a position on my own, no pets, no responsibilities, that I could make that decision reasonably easily. You know, ultimately it could be a short-term solution. It actually turns out I completely love it. I completely love it, living in someone else's house, because they're responsible for everything and I just get to go home and make a mess of the kitchen. But it was, you know, at the time it was quite a difficult thing to come to terms with. Now, my dad works with the Church of England Diocese here in Exeter, and he said to me there's a really great debt charity called Christians Against Poverty. They are just one of many debt charities you can use. And I was a bit hesitant about using them because I didn't really want to bring religion into it. But I looked into a number of the debt charities, and what was different about CAP, Christians Against Poverty, was the concept of the debt coach. So all of the debt charities will help you with your debt, but CAP do it by sending a debt coach to your house to talk to you in the first instance. So I was really worried about using the phone now, and I found that making the phone calls really, really stressful. So I made one phone call to CAP and told them I wanted some help, and everything else was done in person or over email, which really helped to alleviate the stress. Now, my debt coach was called Liz, and she brought a lady with her called Catherine, and they came to my flat and they saw me in person. And it just made such a huge difference being able to talk to somebody who understood what was going on, knew how to solve the problem, because when you're stood there looking at the problem from here and you're looking up at something that's completely crushing you, it's impossible to know how to lift it off. Whereas they came along, Liz and Catherine came along, and they were basically this crane that lifted it off me and just made me feel so much better about what was going to happen. You know, it wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't a free ride. They weren't going to provide a magic solution. It was still going to be hard work, but they were going to help me, and they knew the steps to take to get that to work. And that for me just made all the difference. So, I said few. So there are sort of 5 steps to being set up with the debt coaches. I met with Liz and Catherine, they came round, and they assessed my total debt. So I had to provide them with copies of all my bank statements, all my credit card bills. I had to give them all my that's my 20 minutes. Is it right if I carry on? I've only got a couple more slides. Yeah. They basically assessed my debt, helped me construct a realistic budget. And that didn't just mean well, how much do you want to eat? How much food money do you want? And how much is your rent? And everything else goes to your debt. But things like, well, you need new clothes, so you better have £10 a month for new clothes. And you need to get your hair cut, so you better have £10 a month to save for a haircut. Which I had not considered when I was in the grip of debt. I had not considered about things like buying new clothes or, you know, any other kind of leisure aspects. You know, I finally had money to buy a round at the pub, which was just amazing. And they took all my paperwork away, gave it to the client setup team, and they sorted it out and just told me that on the 1st of November I needed to make my first payment, and that was it. My debt management plan had begun, and my road to freedom from my debt had started. So basically that's it. I am paying off my debt. I am on a debt management plan. I have medication for my depression. I also had some counselling, and I've been to budgeting classes, and I use budgeting apps to manage my money. I did eventually get a better paid job. I have more sensible living conditions, and I avoid triggers like using the phone or getting phone calls from companies that are phoning me up about my bills. The invention of the online chatbot has changed my life for the better. But I just wanted to talk finally about some statistics that I learned from CAP earlier this year in a report they produced called Stacked Against. So CAP visit over 8,000 households a year, and this sounds like a pitch for CAP. It is a little bit, but also there are other debt charities available. And they produced these statistics, and they said if you visited 100 households, you'd find 87 of them had one or more additional difficulties. So an additional difficulty is something in the black triangle on that side. So they might be a single parent, or they might have mental health problems, or they might be unemployed, or they might have a terminal illness, for example. What really shocked me was that 50% of those households they visit will have 3 or more of those additional difficulties. And 23% will have 5 or more of those additional difficulties. And that to me suggests that this is a systemic and social problem, not a personal responsibility one. I was telling Luna and Robert over coffee earlier that it was only when I was writing this talk that I actually forgave myself for getting into debt 7 years ago, or 10 years ago. How long have I been out of university? Longer than that, 12 years ago. And that's a long time to carry around the burden of shame for being in debt, especially when I consider how simple it was to get help once I could ask for it, and to see how systemically there are problems, there are challenges facing me that were not my fault, and there was nothing I could have ever done about them. So that is basically my debt journey. I am really proud to end this talk by telling you that I will be debt free on the 1st of September this year.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that very personal story. We have sort of run over time, but we do have some minutes for questions. Maybe the 3 of you could come up and we could open it to the floor.
Okay.
If there are any questions.
That's right, my level.
Let the people who need to go. Yes.
Are you not appalled by the adverts on television and elsewhere for people to get into debt? Check your credit rating.
Yeah. I think they should be illegal. I just think it's terrible, the fact that credit cards are silly, because that credit card, that 55% of my debt that was credit cards, I just rang up a credit card company and said, can I have another credit card? And they said yes. And they didn't check my income or anything, they just freely gave it to me. And that was really dangerous. I needed the money because I was really struggling to make ends meet, but they just gave me another credit card, and then I had loads of debt. So I do think they should be illegal. That's just my personal opinion. But
I just wanted to excuse me, add to that. I've been where Lucy's been, and we're friends, we know each other, and so yeah, huge respect for that. What I would say is that the shame stigma around poverty contributes to creating poverty as well, in the sense my experience is that debt is something that happens to other people who can't cope, people who are a bit inadequate. Oh, and lo and behold, there I am in it.
yeah.
So it's wholly cyclical in that sense, that if you don't have the stuff, then you have something to be ashamed of, and if you have the stuff and can't pay for it, you have something to be ashamed of, and it's just a horrible cycle.
Steve, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for 3 very powerful talks in their own ways. I just wondered, has anyone got a comment on, I suppose, the last maybe 5 years of populism and the shift in some ways of shame to blame and finding different others to blame the situation on. So Felicity used austerity, but a lot of people shift the burden away from blaming austerity to blaming immigration or something like that. And of course, a lot of current politics is based on trying to mobilise people in poverty in order to vote for certain kinds of speculative solutions to their problems. But I just wonder if that comes out in any of the kind of things that the work that you've been doing.
Our work was done before that time period, but we did look at the process of political discourse across the 7 countries in the first project, and the sort of interaction between social views, government, the role of the media, and obviously the discourse is long. In the UK, it's really interesting to me anyway. At around 1560, the word deserving enters into the English language. It wasn't there before. And the context of that is Henry VIII and the if you like, the nationalisation of the church by Henry VIII, at which point he took over, though he didn't realise at the time, responsibility for caring for people in poverty. So from Constantine in Rome onwards, the church has held responsibility for dealing with the poor. And the historians that I've spoken to argue that in that era, the church responded to need, irrespective of its cause. But when the responsibility shifted to the state, and at that point it was funded through landowners' contributions at parish level, the taxpayer started to make a distinction according to the cause of poverty. And the word deserving, look in the Oxford English Dictionary, the definition of deserving is as in the deserving poor, which illustrates how profoundly that concept it plays out in UK discourse. And I think I edited a book of their speech on eradication of child poverty, and I think they gave it the title of Making Welfare Popular. And that was in a sense what he set out to do, and he set it out to make welfare popular by this notion of effectively deserving. Rights and responsibilities was the agenda that he constructed. The message that got across was rights and irresponsibility, and that discourse played out, and in that sense, once you triggered that process, you got politicians competing for sound bites in that sort of discourse. And I've written a paper that analysed that process over that period of time. I can't speak for this notion of shifting from shaming to blaming that you spoke about.
I was just going to add very, very briefly to bring you back to the contemporary day. I don't think it's directly answers your question, Steve, but just to sort of say that yes, absolutely, people are always finding other things as reasons, and I think the UN the Philip Alston report on poverty in the UK is a very good example of the government just being in total denial about what's going on, and them actually kind of presenting that report as being false news. They absolutely denied every aspect of that report. So yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, we've got someone outside the door who's desperate to get in.
Yeah.
And we need to get moving. Lucy, do you want to?
I agree with everything you have both said.
Right. Thank you for coming and keep going in.